We've now learnt how to add controls in Avalonia, and next up we want to take a look at adding some layouts. We saw in the last video, if we just open up the existing adding controls, which is this one here, we can see the issue we had is if we tried to, let's say, get the previewer up and add, say, multiple buttons, you'll realize that you can't add multiple controls, which is a big problem. And that is because we have things called layouts that enable us to have multiple items inside of a single one. And this is pretty much critical to any UI. You can see in the documentation, we can do things like stack panels and grids, which in this instance, they've laid inside of a stack panel, which can obviously be embedded. And those really are the two primary layouts. They can cover 99% of everything you need to do. So let's just take a look at the difference with them. We're not concerned about the content that goes inside. We're more concerned about what the difference is. So let me explain this simply. If we put a stack panel here, and now inside of here, if we put buttons, it's easier to see than to explain. So we'll just say content equals button 1, copy and paste. And you can see in the preview, we then have, maybe we zoom in a bit on there, you can see all the buttons are going down. We have a few options we can toggle here. One is orientation on the stack panel. We can change to horizontal. The default is vertical, and now they go left to right. And another one is spacing. So if we did say spacing of 10, you can see it's the spacing between the items inside. So a stack panel, as the name suggests, stacks things, either horizontally or vertically. We could have a stack panel where, let's say, button 2, we're going to cut out. We're going to put another stack panel inside of a stack panel. And inside of here, we're going to put a load of button 2s. And now we've got a stack panel embedded inside of a stack panel. And let's change this orientation to horizontal. And now you can see we have a stack going vertically, where the second item inside of that stack panel is another stack panel that's going to go horizontally. So this allows you to start constructing UI. And you could maybe imagine this in a very simple terms as, say, moving the stack panel up, and maybe this being a top header bar and these being a sidebar, for example. And they're the easiest layout to use. They're a nice quick way of dumping controls in. And now the other main layout element is a grid. This one's a bit more difficult to get your head around, but let's say we change this now to a grid. So inside a grid, let's put a button with content button 1, and let's just put a few in. And you can see what happens here is the buttons are getting overlaid one on top of the other. So this is just aligned vertically centered, but you can see here, every button is stacked on top of each other. So you might think this is a stack panel, but in a Z-axis. However, this is simply because we just haven't specified what part of the grid these buttons are going in. Now, a grid is like an Excel spreadsheet. So if we enable, the best way to visualize this is on the grid, turn on ShowGridLines to true. And if we just zoom out so we can see all this, you'll see here there's nothing. Let's change the background color to red so we know where the grid is. There's the grid. We know it fills everything by default, but you'll see there's no lines showing. So we don't need to show the red background because we know the grid is now covering the whole visible area, but we don't have any columns or rows. So the first thing in a grid is to type in ColumnDefinitions, and let's just do star, comma, star, comma, star. And now you can see we have 3 columns. So these are the columns like an Excel spreadsheet. If we then do the exact same thing, let's just put these on new lines. And we do this exact same thing here for now row definitions. We'll do star dot star dot star. And you can see there, we now have a classic Excel grid, or it almost looks like we could play a game of tic-tac-toe. And now what we can do, and we zoom that in a little bit so you can see, we can, where we have all these items, see how it's now complaining that we haven't specified a grid or a row? The way that we tell the content inside of the grid which column or row it needs to go on is with a special kind of syntax, which is to do grid first, then dot, and now we can specify the column or the row. So for this one, if I specify 0, it's where it already is. If I specify 1, you can see the button moves to 2, and 3 will be invalid. So you've got 0, 1, and 2. You can move this button between. And the same for the row, simply specify 0, 1, or 2 to move things around. This allows us to also, importantly, put multiple controls in the exact same column or row, which is useful. So let's first just put these buttons on specific columns and rows. I'm going to just copy and paste this over and over. Then I'm going to move it to 0, 1, 2, and 1 over there. And let's now talk about the column definitions and row definitions. You'll see this star. What this means is consume all remaining available space that isn't consumed by other definitions. So to understand that concept a bit more, first you need to understand what we can do here. So the comma is telling us it's a new column or row. If there's 2 commas in the row, there's 3 rows, for example. So it's just a separator. If, for example, instead we set the column here to 10, you can see that's very small. Let's set it to 100. And now we have 100 unit width in the column. And the 2 remaining stars now take up equally the remaining space. So you can think of the star as once all other columns are consumed with their content, whatever's left gets split equally between these. There's another thing called auto. And what auto does is fill to the content size. So rather than change button 4 and give it more content, you can see that this column then grows based on the content's width. So you have a fixed size, you have an auto to take up the available space that the content needs, and then you have this star. So if we add an extra column, so we now have 4, you can see these stars, the more you add, take up the available remaining space. And finally, you can actually do a number in front of the star to say, for example, 2 times the available space. So you can think of star as a value of all remaining space left divided by the total number that have a star. So in this case, there's 2 columns that take up a star. Whereas if we put a third one in, you can see the star is still then 2 times 1/3. So you count up the number of stars, 1, 2, 3, and then multiply it by this. So this gets 2 lots of stars, this gets 1, and this gets 1. You can also do fractions, so you can specify a value. It's like a multiplier to however much space is available and remaining. Once you play with these and visualize them and see them with grid lines enabled, it's very easy to kind of understand what's going on. What you typically do in a grid is you'll have, say in the rows, we'd normally have, say, an auto, and then something consuming the remaining space. So this could be like, say, a header, something else, and then a list of content where you'd want to just take up the remaining space. You'll notice that there's no gap between them. So if I change this to auto, these buttons, if we zoom right in, are basically touching each other. So on the grid here, we can actually do now a margin on the grid. This is fairly new, or sorry, not margin. The spacing, is it now? Yes, we now have column spacing and row spacing. So similar to a stack panel, we can add this spacing. And this is fairly new. This is something that's been a desire of mine for many, many months, if not years. I actually implemented a solution for this right on the time when we ended up releasing it officially in Avalonia. So I kind of designed mine a little bit too late, but we now have spacing we can have between the columns and rows. And before this, we had to add extra ones, for example, say 10 auto, 10 star, 10 star. And this was our way of, before we had these spacings, we would do by manually adding spacings here, and then we'd have to bump up this column here, and it was a nightmare. You can see already how the syntax starts becoming messy. So instead of that now, you guys don't have to worry about that, and you have something that's nice and easy to just do spacing between the buttons. And then when you're happy with the layout, you turn off the grids, but you can see how easy it is to visualize a grid if you enable the grid lines. So they are the 2 main layouts. I'd say the way I always pick of which to choose from, a stack panel or a grid, and it doesn't always hold true for every situation, but the first thing to think of usually is, do you want to consume all available space? So are you in some part of the UI where you want to fill the content wants to grow to consume the available space? So for example, if this was an application, or this was even this actual rider window, and this code window here we're seeing, we want this to take up all available space. So if we drag this up and down, you can see this code window here is expanding to take up all available remaining space, while the header stays at the top and the build stays at the bottom. That is a situation where you want a grid. Anytime you want to take up available space, as opposed to taking up just what space you need, then you choose a grid. Otherwise, you usually choose a stack panel. That's your general initial deciding factor of whether you're going to use a grid or a stack panel. The other option as well, if you want multiple controls in the same location, like with a grid, you can move them to overlay, then you might want to use a grid. However, there's other ways of doing that with a normal panel, not necessarily a grid. But I hope that gets you into thinking about layout controls. Now, this is how we add multiple elements to the UI versus one.